next presentation by Fabio Rizzo and Cristoforo Demartino. The title is Pressure Models for Hyperbolic Paraboloid Roofs.
Thank you, Chairman, for your introduction. I'll share my screen. Also, good afternoon, everybody. My research is on pressure modes for hyperbolic paraboloid roofs. We discussed the application of a singular value decomposition for pressure coefficients time history to estimate more efficient wind load distributions on hyperbolic paraboloid cable net roofs. In particular, we are focused on asymmetrical load configurations because they are very significant and they are stricter load combinations for, in particular, for cable structures. I'm working on these kind of structures. We can see some examples, very famous, like Raleigh Arena, Calgary Arena, but also the Olympic Stadium in London to 2012. In particular, the hyperbolic paraboloid roof with cable net and membrane are made of three substructures. In this slide, we can see supports that are generally made of reinforced concrete or steel structures and cable net with two orders of cables, upward and downward. Upward cables are load bearing under gravitational load, and downward cables are load bearing and suction like wind action. And in this slide, we can see also a typical connection that restrained only the relative vertical displacements of cables. Of course, these kind of structures are very light, so they are very sensitive to asymmetrical loads, like, for example, the snow accumulation given by windstorm or wind action for its nature, its dynamic fluctuation. In this slide, we can see an example of a particle image velocimetry test in wind tunnel, and we can see the vortex shedding around the cross section of a typical hyperbolic paraboloid roof. So my presentation is organized in 5 phases. Experimental campaign. This research is based on an experimental campaign carried out in the Creative Wind Tunnel in Prato. Totally 16 different geometries were performed to estimate pressure coefficients on rigid body models. In this slide, we can see 8 different geometries with the square and rectangular shape, but where I tested also circular and elliptical plane shapes. A view of pressure coefficient trend. In this case, we can see mean pressure coefficient trends for 0 degree. I acquired 16 different degrees of wind angle. And in this slide, we can see very different the differences between square and rectangular plane shape, but also between 2 different geometry of the roof. As for example, G1 and G3, flatter and more curved roof. And after a lot of after 10 years. Finally, the commission of CNR 207 decided to incorporate these results, so we can find pressure coefficients for square, rectangular, elliptical, and circular plane shape hyperbolic paraboloid roofs. So we use it in this research, the singular value decomposition to have a synthetic representation of the experimental campaign. In this slide, we can see the methodology. Matrix, experimental matrix A is decomposed by matrix U, that content fluctuation information, and matrix S, and in particular its diagonal, that content the kinetic information of modes, and the matrix V that contains the spatial distribution of pressure modes. In this case, we have totally 89 pressure taps for square models and 95 pressure taps for rectangular shape. So an example of pressure mode number 1 trend for all 8 geometries, we can see that there is a very relevant difference between a square on the left plane shape and the rectangular on the right plane shape. And in this slide, a comparison between the first 20 pressure modes for geometry G1, and we can see that there are a lot of pressure modes that have an asymmetrical distribution. It's very interesting because all maps given by standards or codes are symmetrical. So with the purpose to obtain a significant and relevant wind load combinations that are able to capture the asymmetrical distribution given by the wind, so we have started a synthetic representation of pressure modes. In this case, the first 20 pressure modes were used to reconstruct the experimental database with an error smaller than 10% using the truncated singular value decomposition approach. And then a parameterization of the pressure modes through a polynomial surface as a function of geometries, of roof geometries, and pressure taps position on the roof. In this case, we have obtained the envelope pressure coefficients maps, and so consequently new and envelope pressure wind load combinations. But it's interesting, according to me, to see the asymmetrical wind load distribution, and so we have used the asymmetrical wind pressure modes to obtain surrogated pressure coefficients distribution, asymmetrical pressure coefficients distribution, and so consequently asymmetrical wind action distribution. Finally, we have applied these new surrogated wind load distributions on finite element method and models analysis, and we have obtained interesting results because asymmetrical distribution permits to capture the maximum displacements up and downward that are not observed using maps given by code. So the main result is that codes have to consider the asymmetrical distribution for cable structures, in particular for cable net roofs, because in this way it's possible to have a more precise design of cross sections cables and press stress. So some references, and thank you for your attention.